Welcome everyone to the session on the investment opportunities for the EU in Sri Lanka.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Aibuan and Vanakkam. My name is John. It's a great pleasure for me, in my capacity as a director and in-house counsel of the European Chamber of Commerce of Sri Lanka, to welcome you all and to lead this session at which we will discuss investing in Sri Lanka from an EU perspective. We have a busy program ahead of us, which has 5 segments. Firstly, we will hear some welcome remarks by Her Excellency, Ms. Grace Asirvadam, Ambassador of Sri Lanka in Brussels. Those welcome remarks will be followed by an overview of the Sri Lanka-EU relationship by Mr. Thorsten Bargfreder, sitting here to my left, Deputy Head of Mission at the Delegation of the European Union in Colombo. Next, we will have Dr. Nishan Dimel, Director of Verite Research, who will present on the macroeconomic outlook and investment opportunities. Thereafter, there will be a panel discussion with representatives of 4 European invested businesses here who will tell us about their Sri Lanka story. This will be followed by questions and answers from the audience for our panelists, if any. I will moderate the panel discussion and the question and answer session. In a short while, I will hand over the virtual microphone to Her Excellency, Ms. Grace Asirvadam, to deliver her opening remarks. But before I do so, I'd like to briefly introduce her. Ambassador Grace Asirvadam is a senior member of the Sri Lanka Foreign Service with over 33 years of service. Currently, she is the Ambassador of Sri Lanka to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union. Prior to that, she was Secretary to the State Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Asirvadam served as Sri Lanka's ambassador to Nepal and the Netherlands and has held several senior positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Colombo. She has also served in the Sri Lankan missions in Germany and Pakistan. As an international civil servant, Ambassador Asirvadam held the position of Deputy Director General with the rank of UN Assistant Secretary General at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons from 2011 to 2015. She is a graduate of the University of Jaffna and of the University of Colombo. Your Excellency, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to deliver the welcoming remarks at this session on the issue of the Sri Lanka's Virtual Investment Forum. The ongoing Virtual Investment Forum of Sri Lanka is focusing on a global audience, in which Europe is undeniably an integral part of it. Over the years, the links between Sri Lanka and Europe have been firmly established in many areas, including in trade, investment, and other economic activities. Needless to say, the European Union, representing 27 countries as a regional bloc, is of paramount importance to Sri Lanka for economic development. The relations between Sri Lanka offers more than what the EU investment policy aims to ensure for the EU investors abroad. Mainly, the EU investment policy with partner countries especially focuses on securing a level playing field so that EU investors abroad are not discriminated, making it easier to invest by creating a predictable and transparent business environment, promoting investment that supports sustainable development, respect for rights, including human, labor, and environmental standards, allowing and facilitating the setting up of enterprises by making sure investors can access the market and do not face discrimination between the EU and non-EU investors, creating a favorable regulatory framework both when the investor enters the market and when the investor engages in economic activities in a country. So these are expectations under the EU investment policy. In this regard, I categorically say, without exaggeration, that Sri Lanka treats investors as the most welcome partners and offers strong fundamentals for investment, together with regulatory support, investment protection, investment incentive framework, and everything that an investor for in a country. What Sri Lanka offers under the consistent and time-tested investment policy framework, incentive regime, pro-growth policies, and enabling regulatory environments are far beyond the basic requirements envisaged in the EU investment policy in partner countries, and also through their standalone investment agreements. Further, as regards market access, Sri Lanka, with its bilateral FTAs with India, Pakistan, and Singapore, offers duty-free access to over 4,000 products to both India and Pakistan. These markets, which consist of over 1.6 billion people. Further, the GSP Plus will also provide zero tariff access to around 7,000 product lines to the EU market, which has a consumer base of nearly 450 million people. Further, in addition to Sri Lanka's constitutional guarantee for protection of investments, around 10 EU countries have entered into bilateral agreements with Sri Lanka on investment protection and avoidance of double taxation, which have also provided strong protection for foreign investment against expropriation and non-commercial risk. There is an EU-Sri Lanka investment dialogue which serves to address all issues related to the investments in Sri Lanka for the EU countries. Further, a fast-tracking investor facilitation mechanism is also in place, led by a cabinet subcommittee. By now, the ongoing investment forum would have given enough and more information to the potential investors. Sri Lanka is indisputably the most attractive investment destination in South Asia for investment in apparels, agriculture, education, export manufacture, infrastructure, tourism, wealth management, and portfolio investment, banking, and many more. Given the conducive conditions for FDI and portfolio investments in Sri Lanka, I strongly believe that this forum will help bridging the gap created by lack of awareness and lack of information, as well as dispelling misinformation. I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those welcome remarks, and also for setting, the overall framework for investment in our country. We now move on to Mr. Thorsten Bargfreder, who will deliver an overview of the Sri Lanka-EU relationship. I'd first like to say a few words of introduction. Mr. Thorsten Bargfreder is the Deputy Head of Mission of the Delegation of the European Union to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Mr. Bargfreder is a senior official of the Diplomatic Service of the European Union. He comes with a broad background and experience in the field of diplomacy, economic affairs and development, as well as security and defense issues. He has been posted in Colombo since 2018, and previous postings included not only the EU's headquarters in Brussels, but also Kenya, Pakistan, and Moscow. Over to you, Mr. Bargfreder.
Yeah, thank you, John. And thank you to the Board of Investment and the European Chamber to making this discussion possible here this afternoon. I think it's a very good moment to talk about trade and investment, as all the economies in the world are still struggling with the effects of the COVID pandemic. And as European Union, we believe this is a good moment to work more together, not less. We believe open borders, open economies is a key factor in bringing growth back to all economies on the globe. The ambassador in Brussels already very well described the expectations of EU investors, so I don't have to go too much into detail on our investment relations. Let me just highlight once again how important it is for European investors, I believe, to have predictability. So regulations don't change too quickly. It's very important as well to have a minimum level playing field. The ambassador described it well with local companies. And it was also good to hear, if I may say, that yesterday the secretary to the presidency reiterated again that the current import restrictions are of temporary nature, and we're looking forward to have them phased out over time. I would like to talk a little bit more about our trade relations, which are strongly shaped by the GSP Plus agreement. Now, why is this important for Sri Lanka? Again, the ambassador mentioned the 450 million consumers in the 27 member states. These are high-income markets. The EU is still the biggest market in the world, and it's still one of the top export destinations of Sri Lanka as well. The total of exports, just mind you, of Sri Lanka, out of the total, 2/3 go combined to the European Union, the US, and the UK. And we are now just the second market, just behind US after the exit of the United Kingdom from the EU. There is a clear trade surplus of Sri Lanka with the European Union because our market remains wide open, and that is also our belief, in principle, even under COVID times. With the GSP Plus mechanism, since 2007, 66% roughly of product lines have tariff-free access to the European market. And in total, this led to, since 2017, a growth of more than 20% of Sri Lankan exports to the European Union. We do have a deficit now of 1 billion euro, with Sri Lanka, which is fine for the European Union. We don't believe that trade necessarily is only beneficial if you have a positive trade balance, and so we believe that overall GSP Plus has worked well for Sri Lanka, and there's still great potential. One thing is the utilization rate is relatively low. The reason is that only 60% of the trade coming from Sri Lanka to Europe uses GSP Plus preferences. One reason is the relatively low diversification. Nearly half of the exports are in the textile area, and the internal rules of double value addition just means that not 100% of the products can benefit from it. So there's still more potential there. Also in diversification using other industries. One idea we can clearly see is the relatively high labor and environmental standards in Sri Lanka lead to sort of a market, a competitive edge in everything that is fair trade, sustainable production, and that is going to be more and more important for European consumers as well. Of course, that means that Sri Lanka on its side would need to continue implementing the 27 international conventions that GSP Plus is based on. So just to wrap up, beyond GSP Plus and our trade relations, of course, the EU is a development partner of Sri Lanka. Since 1995, when we opened our office here, over 1 billion euro was spent in grants. No conditions attached. We also have more and more relations as direct investors as well. Since in the last 10 years, either the EU directly or the European financial institutions spent more than 500 million euros in credit lines here. Now looking to the future, the big priority for the EU back home is the Green Deal, is the green recovery, and this is also reflected in our relations with third countries. Green recovery, transition to a green economy will be our #1 objective in our cooperation, and we are looking forward to be joined by investors on their journey. Back to you, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Balgfreder, for those informative remarks about the relationship between the EU and Sri Lanka. You touched upon the GSP Plus benefits. which I think we'll hear in our panel discussion, are very relevant to business. One area you did mention was the trade-related assistance program, recently concluded, which was funded by the EU in the recent past and which came up with various good things like a push towards trade facilitation and also the national export strategy. The relationship between the EU and Sri Lanka will undoubtedly continue to be beneficial to Sri Lanka going forward. And I hope that European companies, especially SMEs, will understand the potential advantages of investing in Sri Lanka, especially in the context of GSP+. We now have the pleasure of hearing the perspectives of Dr. Nishan Dimel on the macroeconomic outlook and investment opportunities in Sri Lanka. Dr. Dimel kindly agreed to participate on this panel at quite short notice, and I would like to express my personal gratitude for that. Dr. Dimel is the Executive Director and Head of Research at Verite Research, a think tank, providing an analytical research and advice on economic, political, and legal issues. He has served on the Presidential Task Force on Health Sector Reform and the Presidential Committee on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Dangerous Drug Regulation, and on the National Steering Committee on Social Security. He earned his economics degree at Harvard and his master's and doctorates at Oxford, where he was a Chevening Scholar. He has also lectured in economics at Oxford. Dr. Dimel, a warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank you for inviting me on this investment opportunities for the EU in Sri Lanka and for the BOI, for the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for organizing this event. I think a macroeconomic outlook is something that many investors ask for. A lot of the details on taxation and the tax incentives, I think, have been presented in a forum that I moderated yesterday. Also today, I think Thorsten has explained them. So let me just kind of forward to the critical questions investors are asking. Just as background, Hans Vijayasuriya, who's the chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and perhaps the visionary of this investor forum, in his opening remarks yesterday, made quite an incisive analysis. And to restate it in a nutshell, he pointed out that Sri Lanka is a place with great economic potential, and the policies and actions of government will shape the opportunity to realize that potential, which I think we hear echoed by every forum, every panel. And looking beyond the details of tax incentives and particular sectors, I think there is a discussion or a question that emerges for everyone trying to enter Sri Lanka. The question is on the slide: is Sri Lanka's debt sustainable? So I think it is the elephant in the room, which I will try to address briefly in this short presentation. This graph shows you Sri Lanka's debt to GDP from 1951 onwards. And the value right at the end, which is the present value, is 101% of GDP. I think what's important to note is not only that this value is high, 100% is considered a pivotal value, but that this is not the first time that Sri Lanka has had a debt to GDP ratio of above 100%. It was true for 2 years in 1988 and 89. It was true for 4 years from 2001 to 2004. And nevertheless, in both those instances, Sri Lanka was able to bring the debt to GDP ratio down and has this track record of not defaulting on its debt. And if you've listened to the policymakers who've spoken yesterday and today, they've re-emphasized that they are keen to maintain this track record of not defaulting on debt. And I think that's important to hear and important to analyze as well. The Public Finance Analysis Group at Verite Research has written a paper to analyze Sri Lanka's debt sustainability. It has been presented to several key stakeholders. It's not yet in public release, but the conclusions I will share with you today is drawn from that paper. The two kind of critical underlying principles to notice or to recognize is that debt to GDP can decline provided the interest rate is not too high. So it's not just about the quantity of debt. If the interest you're paying is less than inflation and growth of GDP, then that enables you to bring some sustainability. And secondly, for countries like Sri Lanka, that's borrowing in foreign currency, not local currency, the depreciation of the currency matters because that functions as an interest rate, and high currency depreciation can cause difficulty. So I want to just focus all your minds on just 4 critical conditions for debt sustainability. First is domestic interest rate is no higher than the rate of inflation. And if you watch these conditions, you can watch whether Sri Lanka's debt is sustainable or not. Second is that foreign exchange interest rate is no higher than the real GDP growth. Third is that the primary deficit, that is the budget deficit without interest payments, is less than 60% of GDP growth, or 0.6 of GDP growth. And that depreciation is no higher than the rate of inflation, depreciation on currency. To quickly tell you where Sri Lanka is on these 4 conditions, and I will analyze them very quickly before I finish. Domestic interest rate in Sri Lanka has effectively halved in the last year. And that has really, if you listen to the governor of the central bank, the tolerance for inflation has increased in the mid-single digits to the upper mid-single digits. And domestic interest rates are pretty much in the same range, which gets the first condition through. Because of a large amount of concessional debt in the debt portfolio, the weighted average cost of interest on foreign debt is really today 3.9%, which means that at a GDP growth rate of 4%, the second condition is also met. The third condition, where the primary deficits can be kept to 0.6 of GDP growth, simply means that if GDP growth is 5%, the primary deficit can be no more than 3%. Now, that's something easy to watch. It's something under the control of policymakers. So I echo Hans Vijayasuriya's idea that the potential can be untapped by policy that delivers this deficit. The question of depreciation is a little more complicated because while this condition that depreciation is no higher than the rate of inflation is, vanilla economic theory, every macroeconomic textbook says that's how it'll be. In the short term, this can vary because of the pressures that Sri Lanka has. And here's the simple 2 slides on the synopsis of those pressures. That if you looked at the past 5 years, Sri Lanka had an average repayment of about $3 billion in debt. Going forward, 2020 to 2025, we have an average repayment of $4.5 billion. So really there is a rollover problem. How do you repay this debt if international markets are not willing to lend to Sri Lanka at a reasonable rate? And what you see as a decline in the reserves of Sri Lanka really emerges from the fact that Sri Lanka is trying to repay all its foreign debt without going back to international markets for further borrowing. And that is causing a fairly significant decline in the reserves that we all talk about. So, of course, this is a catch-22 problem because as reserves decline, international markets become more worried about lending to Sri Lanka and think of Sri Lanka as more likely to default. But the reason that Sri Lanka is having declining reserves is precisely because it is unable to raise funds at reasonable interest rates. So effectively, the problem is feeding itself in the current climate. And can be reversed. So what Sri Lanka is doing now, in the absence of having to recourse to international loans at reasonable rates, it's engaging in swap arrangements and other such current bilateral arrangements to try and reduce the foreign debt without going back to the international markets. Now, this is not a bad idea because remember I said that the interest rate, depreciation is the interest rate on foreign debt. So the value at the end of this is 6.5%. This is the current interest component as a percentage of GDP. So Sri Lanka is paying 6.5% of its GDP as interest on existing debt. And depreciation is affecting how much Sri Lanka has to repay. Now again, what you see is that this is not the highest level of interest to debt that Sri Lanka has. There is a history in which there have been times it's been higher. But the most important strategy for government is to reduce this cost. It has successfully reduced the marginal cost of interest on local debt Of course, it will take a couple of years to get fully realized because that's only the marginal cost. So historic debt is still at high interest rates, but that will get unwound to a lower rate. So the million-dollar question for Sri Lanka's macroeconomic outlook then is how does it reduce the cost of international debt to a level that makes it perhaps competitive with taking more local debts. Currently, the strategy to shift to local debt over international debt is simply based on the recognition that it's cheaper to borrow locally than to borrow at the prices that international markets are willing to lend with the depreciation pressure on top of that. So the strategy makes sense. However, implementing that strategy is quite hard because Sri Lanka doesn't have the reserves to refinance the repayment of international debt without engaging in special arrangements and borrowing. So let me end. Domestic interest rate should be no higher than the rate of inflation. Sri Lanka gets a check on that. Foreign exchange interest rate on the outstanding foreign loans is no higher than real GDP growth. We are assuming, and I think most people predict a real GDP growth of about 4%, so Sri Lanka gets a check on that. However, primary deficit should be less than 0.6% of GDP, and there's a question mark. I think the government has made commitments, and watching how those commitments are honored will be important in recognizing the sustainability on this front. And depreciation is no higher than the rate of inflation, which is the last criteria that Sri Lanka has to meet. I think depends a little bit on the confidence that international markets and investors place on Sri Lanka. So in other words, high confidence can be self-reinforcing and positive in ensuring debt sustainability for Sri Lanka. But likewise, low confidence can also be self-reinforcing. So I think for those who are already engaged in Sri Lanka and can see the positive potential, there is the strategic forward I think a question is, can Sri Lanka also generate a higher level of confidence to unlock foreign financing at a reasonable cost? Because if it does so, then there is still a pathway for debt to be sustainable and the concerns of default, I think, don't prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dimel. That was a very informative presentation on quite a topical topic, I'd say. And I can only hope that in the medium and long term, we will see an efficient management of debt in this country, that we will see a period of sustained growth and recovery for Sri Lanka after the horrors of COVID. As a Sri Lankan citizen myself, I must say that our country and people, with all that they have gone through, deserve a break, I think, and hopefully a new period of prosperous, inclusive growth and prosperity. I hope that today will open the door in some small way to that new period. We now move on to the panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted that 4 important European businesses which chose to invest in Sri Lanka have agreed to participate on this panel. The companies represented at this panel discussion in alphabetical order are Decathlon, Global Sports Lanka Private Limited, Omega Line Private Limited, a subsidiary of Calcedonia, and United Tobacco Processors Private Limited, a part of J. Cortez. The representative of United Tobacco Processors will actually join us virtually from Brussels, and will shortly be joined on the stage by Felix Fernando from Omega Line. I think it would be fair to say that anyone living in or around Colombo who leads an active lifestyle would have visited the large Decathlon sports store complex in Bathramula and purchased some form of sporting goods. I know I did recently. I purchased a pair of hiking boots, which turned out to be my real friends as I struggled up a steep climb of the mountains, the beautiful Knuckles Mountains range, not too long ago when interprovincial travel was possible. Decathlon provides directly and indirectly employment to over 7,000 persons in Sri Lanka, and the annual export turnover it generates is around $100 million. Decathlon is represented by Ms. Melis Kuti Ilmaz, its managing directress in Sri Lanka. Melis has been with Decathlon for 14 years, working in a number of functions in Turkey and in France. Here in Sri Lanka, for just under 1 year, I understand, her main mission is to make sports goods produced here accessible to Decathlon entities abroad, and also to make sports goods accessible to Sri Lankans in a broader way. Moving from D to G, Global Sports Lanka Private Limited is an original equipment manufacturer with 2 locations in the BOI zones, manufacturing sails for windsurfers, and employs 900 people. Global Sports Lanka, I'm happy to say, is a long-time member of the European Chamber of Commerce of Sri Lanka. Global Sports Lanka is a BOI-approved venture and an Austrian investment in Sri Lanka. I had the pleasure of visiting their factory last year. I have to say it's truly an intricate task to manufacture windsurfing sails. And having heard from Suresan about a new product line, I look forward to visiting the factory again to observe the manufacturing steps involved once the current wave of the pandemic is over. Mr. Suresan Arunachalam is the managing director, and he has been with the company for 20 years, leading it since 2007, reporting to the shareholder in Austria. He holds an MBA in international trade and logistics and has previously worked as a business analyst solutions provider and was trained in accountancy by KPMG. I now turn to Omega Line, which is a subsidiary of Calzedonia, a well-known Italian company headquartered in Verona. The company offers its fashion collections exclusively through nearly 5,000 stores that's owned or franchised in 57 countries around the world under 7 brand names. Calzedonia, Intimissimi, Tesenis, and Falconeri are the most prominent ones. Calzedonia started operations in Sri Lanka in 1999 through a subsidiary called Omega Lines, and that company is also a long-time member of the Chamber. Over the years, they have expanded in Sri Lanka to 7 production facilities with over 13,000 employees and are one of Sri Lanka's top 5 exporters. Mr. Felix Fernando is the CEO of 2 of Calzedonia's companies in Sri Lanka, as well as a group director. He obtained his MBA from the Postgraduate Institute of Management at the University of Sri Jayawardenepura. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, UK, and has had executive education at the Harvard Business School, the Wharton School, the National University of Singapore, and AOTS Japan. He has over 32 years of experience in the manufacturing industry, out of which over 22 years were in the apparel industry. Mr. Fernando is a past chairman of the Sri Lanka Apparel Exporters Association and is a member of the executive committee of the Joint Apparel Association Forum. Last but not least, joining us all the way from Belgium, virtually, is Frederic van der Marlière of the world-renowned supplier of cigars, J. Cortez, which operates in Sri Lanka through United Tobacco Processors. UTP is another example of an extremely successful foreign investment in Sri Lanka. UTP was established in Sri Lanka in 1987 and so is approaching almost 35 years here. Their business is the processing of tobacco and manufacturing tobacco cuts, cigars, for export to the European market. The entire production is exported out of Sri Lanka. They employ 2,400 people in Sri Lanka. Frederic van der Marlière is current director and former CEO of UTP and is also a director of Olivia Cigars as well as the current managing director of J. Cortez Cigars. He has worked in the family tobacco business in a variety of roles and is the 3rd generation of the van der Marlière family to run J. Cortez. He earned a master's degree in applied economics at the University of Leuven, followed by a master's in marketing management at the reputed Vlerick Management School. Described as a dynamic CEO who was born between tobacco leaves, he harbors a deep-seated passion for the product and abides by the motto, don't smoke, but enjoy. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3 foreign European invested businesses which are engaged in manufacturing for export, and 1 foreign invested European business which carries on both sourcing of manufacture of sports goods for export and business operations in the domestic market. I will start the discussion by asking each of the representatives of these foreign invested European businesses to tell the audience about the beginning of their Sri Lanka story. When introducing our speakers and companies, I did that alphabetically, so let's continue that way, meaning we begin with D for Decathlon. Melis, that means you. My first question is, please tell us about how Decathlon was first tempted to set up in Sri Lanka. What made Decathlon think that Sri Lanka was right for it? How did Sri Lanka fit in with Decathlon's business?
Thank you, John. So Decathlon has been sourcing from Sri Lanka since 2000, especially those days certain items like cycle tubes, kites, model elastan, polar fleece type of product which were managed from Decathlon India office. Sri Lanka was very good country for quality, service, and short lead time for our European customer, with a good level of know-how and compliance in the suppliers and factories.
Okay, great. So the relationship with Sri Lanka seems to have started as a supplier relationship and then developed. It's encouraging to hear that Sri Lanka was seen as offering good quality and service. Moving now to Global Sports Lanka and Suresan, I have the same question for you. Why Sri Lanka? Why did the European investor decide to invest in Sri Lanka, and what made Sri Lanka the right place, Suresan?
Right, it was the year 1983, long time back. That was the time when the leisure sports windsurfing was developing with light but strong material, replacing the traditional film. The patent holding brands were so looking out for a mass production country. The job was handed over to a patent attorney of German nationality who had a friend working in Sri Lanka in the export business. So this combination together with a very innovative local banker and an investment local attorney started the ball rolling. This process went on, and then it came to a point when we were able to bring in real action, value addition. So since 1977, Sri Lanka has been a sewing savvy country with many large garment brands having their export-oriented manufacture in Sri Lanka. As such, the job was easy for finding talent, as manufacturing windsurfing sales was heavy stitching. So these skills were quite ingrained by the 6 years up to 1983. Then we come to a point where Sri Lankan attorney and his local firm started recruiting the local management, reporting to a German managing director, recruiting these sewing savvy operators who have been working for under the multi-fiber arrangement on textile quota, and there were quite a number of them available for recruitment. This process went on, and the local employees started gaining grounds under sailmakers from Germany. So this education process, where the skills were transferred fast, made the company thrive. From 300 employees, now we are at 900. So this is the story, and now the investment there has been reinvestments twice over in 2 zones of the BOI. So that's our story, John.
That's great to hear. So it sounds like when it comes to setting up and making that decision to come to Sri Lanka, that one of the key factors was actually word of mouth from an existing investor.
Exactly.
And also, of course, the investor was impressed by the abundance of stitching skills even back then.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. And you also told us a bit about how things have progressed afterwards. We'll touch on that in the following question again. And we now move on to Omega Line. Felix, can you please tell us about how Calcedonia was tempted to set up in Sri Lanka? What made Calcedonia think Sri Lanka? What made Calcedonia think Sri Lanka was the right place to invest?
Thank you, John. Calcedonia was a relatively young company. It started in around 1988, and they had, by the time that they were planning to come to Sri Lanka, they had only 2 brands. One was Calcedonia and Intimissimi. However, they did not have any production facility. So they were more or less owning the product design, concept, and development. Everything is done in Italy. But they were sourcing the final garments from Europe and Eastern European countries, which is expensive, and they could not get much capacity, so they couldn't. There were some limitations for their expansion because of the quality as well as capacity and the cost. So they decided on the backward integration, and they decided that time to have their own manufacturing facilities. And in that process, they were looking for some countries where to go. And then only 2 countries came as front runners, that is Philippines and Africa. Philippines, because they had a stable and developed apparel industry during that time, especially for the lingerie also they were quite good, and Africa for the cheap labor. But then our main shareholder, Dr. Veronese, he had some connections with a local NGO, which is an international NGO. It's a Christian organization called Don Bosco, whereas he also has studied there some time back. And they have said, no, not those countries. They have been in Sri Lanka for some time. Come to Sri Lanka. On top of that, Dr. Veronese, the major shareholder, he had also some business friends, Italian, who had invested in First Zone, that is Katunayaka, from late 70s, manufacturing hosiery and socks. He also has said, Sri Lanka is good. They have educated, disciplined workforce, and the comparatively low labor costs and abundance of labor. So for these reasons, Caledonia, they decided to come to Sri Lanka, ignoring Philippines or South Africa, also even India. India also one of the contender, but India, what they said was that time, the bureaucracy is quite high, and so they decided to come to Sri Lanka, and here we are here now, John.
Great. So again, it sounds, like there's a common theme here that was knowing someone locally, an investor who could recommend, also the recommendation from the Salesians, and yet another investor, I think, impressed by the good and educated workforce. So finally, on to Fred, who has been waiting patiently over there in Brussels, a long way away. Fred, I hope you're online. Please tell us what first attracted JC Cortez to Sri Lanka as a place to invest.
I hope you hear me well. Hello from Belgium. Perfect. Hello from Belgium indeed, and no worries for the waiting. I would love to be in Sri Lanka, where I live personally, and I enjoyed living there a couple of years. No, we were talking also about the 80s, mid-80s, at a moment where my father was looking for another place to make cigars, because, continuing making cigars from the beginning to the end in Europe was very difficult from a labor cost perspective. And to stay competitive with other manufacturers, he looked for an area to work the tobacco. So the thing that we do in Sri Lanka is cutting wrappers, so the outside leaf of a cigar, and these wrappers come from all over the world. At that moment, he traveled the world, and I think we're a great example of a company that really had the choice. We could go to Senegal in Africa, we tried in Malta in Europe, we tried in Dominican Republic in the Middle Americas, and in Indonesia, and in Sri Lanka. And after the trip to all the different countries, his conclusion was that Sri Lanka was the best option. And I have to say, 35 years almost after date, we're really sure that it was, and we're very happy with that investment. What were the main reasons that he, let's say, evaluated Sri Lanka above all these other countries that I just mentioned? One, the fact that Sri Lanka works with free trade zones to work in was quite unique at that time. And that it shows to me that Sri Lanka as a country always has tried to stay ahead of other countries. You're not so, Sri Lanka is not a huge country, so they have to be agile and quick to react to certain things. So they were, one of the ones that had free trade zones that worked very well. Secondly, that was a more thing specifically for us. A lot of tobacco was coming from Indonesia, so the supply chain was quite good, and the port of Colombo also played a very important role in that. Thirdly, the BOI served as a one-stop shop, and that was a big help. In some countries, you really had to go as a foreign investor from ministry to ministry to ministry, being able to go to a one-stop shop, to one party that is then looking for the different rules and regulations that you have to fulfill. The thing is, we as a family, we want to obey to all rules. We really want to be correct and make sure that everything is done the right way. But if you don't live there, you don't know that. BOI really helped us in that way and made sure that we had a very smooth start, let's say it that way. And then fourth was for us the communication system. It's quite funny to talk about that today while talking live via the internet. 30 years ago, it wasn't at all, or almost 40, it wasn't at all that easy. So having telex was quite unique in the world. Sri Lanka was one of the countries really offering that and offering a kind of communication for us with the company over there. And last but not least, it's not true for the whole population, but at least the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis, I mean, have a good level of English. So the fact that people speak English and that you can communicate with them was for us also very important. This is in a nutshell a little bit what the evaluation was that we did 35 years ago, and why we're still happy that we're there.
Thank you, Fred. That's very interesting. Each company clearly had its own reasons, specific reasons, but there are some common themes in place. And the experience of other investors known to the potential investor, quality of the workforce seem to be common important points. And we also heard about the one-stop shop service, which was offered by the BOI at that time. I had intended to ask each of you to tell our audience next about the experiences of actually setting up in Sri Lanka in the first years of operation. But in the interest of sticking to time, I can see we only have 11 and a half minutes left. We are already overrunning. I'm going to leave out a detailed discussion of that question and what your experiences were in the first years. What I can say is that based on our discussions in preparation for this session, there were some common themes like unavailability of suppliers of components all those years ago, the challenges of finding the right people to become senior management, challenges in setting up and obtaining all necessary approvals, with some of you, however, praising the one-stop shop service of the BOI that operated many years ago. It was also interesting to hear from you about the considerable training efforts made at the outset and the transfer of skills from foreign staff to local staff. So instead of dwelling a lot on experiences at the start of your projects many years ago, I'd like to move on to our next question, which is after the first few years, after getting the teething problems sorted out, how has the journey been for Decathlon since then, Melis? And I kindly ask you to be as brief as you can, because we really are running short of time.
Thank you, John. So we opened our production office in 2010, and we continue to grow our activity in Sri Lanka. Today, we work with 7 fabric suppliers and 9 finished goods suppliers. Approximately, as you informed, there is 7,000 workers are being involved in our activities. So until 2017, we were mainly focusing on production part. And in 2017, we opened our mini retail format in Sri Lanka. And in 2018, we opened our first Decathlon store in Bataramula, in order to sustainably make the pleasure and benefit of sport accessible for Sri Lankan. We start also our official foundation project in 2019 to reveal the potential of young women through sports. A strong asset, according to me, is the stability of our supplier, in fact, that they do what they say. In 2017, as you know, we had a GSP Plus to benefit to the Europe, which brought more competitiveness and help Sri Lanka economy develop and create more value and better job for its people. Geographically, visiting any supplier was also very easy because there was a big improvement and good level of road infrastructure.
That's great, thank you. And it's very interesting to hear about the importance of GSP Plus, which we also heard about from Thorsten. Suresh, as briefly as possible, please, how has the journey been here?
It has been great. When we say it's a success story. In 2005, the original investor grew the company to into a large entity, and also he managed to find another investor to buy it. So really, he benefited by the initial investment. And since the new investor came in, localization took over. Expatriates were no more recruited, and now it's run by me, who is a local. And our workers, they travel to Tenerife, France, and help in the design of the product. So from the leader to the worker, everyone travels overseas, and thereby there's huge job enrichment, and the company is thriving at the moment. In addition, this windsurfing sale industry, we brought in a new product, the surfing kite. And now we are on to the third product, which is a hybrid between the sail and the kite, known as the foil wing. So as the sport develops, and also we develop a tourist destination in Kalpitia, where we do the testing of the surfing kites, which is 6 months round. We have good winds, no breaking waves, and no fear of sharks. So overall, there is growth to the country, to the industry, and to the investor, and to the worker.
That's great to hear, the transference of skills and technology, the development of Sri Lanka as a destination for manufacturing of windsurfing sails. I suppose that might make you feel a little uncomfortable, but it's good for Sri Lanka. So thank you, Suresh. And Felix, over to you very briefly. We actually have supposed to leave 5 minutes for question time, so I fear this may be the last round of questions. We had a lot of other questions, but if you could just tell us a bit about the journey, the success story, and where you are now.
I would say simply it's excellent. There were some challenges though, but we managed well. I remember that when I was interviewed 22 years back as a financial controller, as the first employee of the group by the group president, he mentioned that, we are going to have a small company in Sri Lanka that maybe only 400 to 600 workers, about 10 million US dollar investment. And that's how we started. But by now, we have 4 different legal entities with 7 factories employing over 13,000 people. We have invested more than around 250 million US dollars, and annual sales goes up to about 400 million US dollars. And we were honored soon after the war ended in North. Even the government invited us to set up a factory in the North, which we did. And we are the largest exporter, largest investor in Northern province as well. Invested more than $70 million in the factory, providing more than 2,600 jobs, especially for an area that we are more than 30 years. It was down with the war. And over the years, we also have worked with subcontractors because we need more and more capacity. So we have worked with medium to large subcontract factories. About 50 some years, we have worked with 50 factories like this. And also we have been recognized as many awards, Presidential Export Awards, as well as highest net foreign exchange earner, best corporate citizen, some awards. And the best, I would say, to save time, I would say simply the comment made by the Calzedonia board when we were celebrating our 10th anniversary in 2009. That's the, I think, biggest achievement. So when we started Sri Lanka operations, Calzedonia was only with 300 stores in 6-7 countries. But by 10 years, by the time we were reaching 10 years, that they had increased the number of stores to 3,000 in about 30 countries. And they simply said that without the support from Sri Lanka, without the production and the quality and delivered on time coming from Sri Lanka, they wouldn't have achieved that growth. And even to date, you have heard from John saying earlier, it's nearly 5,000 outlets in 57 countries. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Felix. That's a really, really impressive success story. And it's just wonderful to hear also that there's been investment in the north of the country and that you're providing employment up there. So we now move on to Fred, back to Belgium. Your journey started a bit earlier, I think, than everyone here. How has it been for UTP? I remember you mentioning that UTP started out quite small, but you consistently grew, and I think you're now one of the largest manufacturers. Please share your experiences with us, Fred.
I'll do it quick also to give you some time to continue or maybe do something else. So, I mean, we are indeed, we started very small with only 4 machines and maximum 20, well, let's say 10 to 15 people. So it was a very, very small startup that was done directly and 100% by our family. Today, I mean, we are the largest bobbin manufacturer worldwide and work with over 2,500 people with 2 factories, over 3 factories, but on 2 different sites within Sri Lanka. We feel, look, in general, I mean, we have lived the period, the very difficult period that the country survived with the civil war. And I have to say, being able to stay in the country and to continue to sit here today is really because we're, I mean, very happy and satisfied with what Sri Lanka gave to us and what we could give back to Sri Lanka as a whole. So, yeah, I think a nice story, and it's surely something that we did together with the EU, with Sri Lanka. And me living there for a couple of months, couple of years, it also showed, and I mean, let's say in a certain way also showed me a lot what Sri Lanka can give, I mean, for as an investor, and what the possibilities are in the country.
Okay, well, thanks, Fred. That's really inspiring. I mean, to hear of a small business which then grew exponentially. It's not, I think, the first example that we've had like that. If I'm not mistaken, Lodestar, which became one of the largest solid rubber tire manufacturing businesses, was also started out in a very small way. And this just does bring me to one point, and I think it ties back nicely to the earlier comments about government policy being able to kind of shape the future development of this country. If you cut out SMEs and you make the investment thresholds too high, I think you risk losing out on success stories like the ones that we've heard so far. So I've just had a look at my WhatsApp feed. The organizers are supposed to be sending me the hundreds of questions out there from the viewers, but I'm told that none have arrived, so we're actually doing quite well on time. But I fear, and I'm sorry, my dear panelists, after all that hard preparation that you put in, I won't be able to ask you any more questions. I was going to ask you about things like, the biggest challenges you faced, the positives of doing business in Sri Lanka, the words of advice or top tips that you might have for people. But I fear we're pretty much out of time. We've got exactly 1 minute and 10 seconds left. It just now then remains for me to thank everyone for all the hard work that they put in to the panel, and for sharing really your experiences with us. Sometimes people can be a bit uncomfortable discussing where things have not been perfect, but the four of you have been open, frank, and pragmatic, highlighting what went well and what is going well, but also recognizing where things could have been and could be better. I know we had many discussions. For example, Melis and I were talking about the difficulty of sometimes of the process in getting visas and work permits. And I would just mention here that at the European Chamber, we have developed a position paper on visas and work permits, which we hope to present to the authorities and which we hope will simplify matters. We also had discussions about issues with customs. I know for Melis, the import ban and the high rates of customs duty mean that sometimes it's difficult to fulfill one of her missions, which is to supply sports goods to Sri Lankans at a reasonable price. Again, the Chamber has developed, position papers on various aspects of customs law, and once the pandemic reduces, we hope to meet with the authorities and present these. In particular, we're pushing for, advanced customs rulings, a good system, and automation of various customs processes. Really, thank you for your insights and your enlightening remarks, all of you panelists, for the many potential investors I'm sure are watching out there. Thank you, Melis from Decathlon, Suresan from Global Sports Lanka, Felix from Omega Line, and Frederick from United Tobacco Processors. Thank you also to Her Excellency Grace Asirvadam in Brussels. Thank you to Thorsten Bargfreder from the delegation of the European Union in Colombo, to Nishan Demel for his presentation on the big elephant in the room, and also to everyone watching from home or from the office. Thank you for joining us at this event. I hope that you found the insights useful. This session was organized by the European Chamber of Commerce of Sri Lanka at the invitation of the Board of Investment. We were invited by the BOI to do this, and it has been a pleasure in particular to work with Ms. Nilupul De Silva, Director Investment Promotion. If any European company out there has found that its interest has been piqued by what you heard today, the European Chamber would be very happy to hear from you and to help you look further into establishing yourselves in Sri Lanka. Several of our panelists have mentioned about the importance of talking to the right people, and we can help you with that. So until we hear from you, take care, stay safe. Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, arrivederci, goodbye everyone.